Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day to day lives.
And today we're very excited to have Sandra Chwialkowska on the show. Sandra is a television producer and writer who lives in Los Angeles. Most recently, she sold and developed an original TV pilot for ABC. Previously, she served as co-executive producer on the Golden Globe-nominated ABC series Alaska Daily, created by Oscar winner writer Tom McCarthy and starring two-time Oscar winner Hilary Swank. Sandra was co-executive producer on the Paramount Plus summer action-adventure series Blood and Treasure. She has written for multiple series, including the Emmy-nominated The Hardy Boys for Hulu, Lost Girl for Sci-Fi, Rookie Blue for ABC, X Company for Netflix, and the Jackie Kennedy miniseries After Camelot for Reels. Sandra holds BA in Literature and Film Studies from Yale, and she studied creative writing at Oxford. The Ends of Things is her first novel. Sandra, welcome to the program. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's a thrill
Welcome.
to be here.
We are so excited to have you and to talk about your incredible debut novel, The Ends of Things. But I think what I wanted to start with, and I imagine Greg will too, because he has a little more in common with you on the kind of screen and TV writing side of things. But how did you kind of have this path to writing for the screen to the page?
Well, it's a long winding road. I had wanted to be a novelist since I was a kid,
Mm,
but the television writing career sort of happened first, which I
mm,
know is unusual. Oftentimes, it's a playwright or a story writer who falls into television, but for me, it was the other way around. So I had written some unfinished manuscripts after college, um, and but after I graduated, I moved to Los Angeles, became an assistant to a writer, thinking that
mm,
proximity would bring me closer to my dream. But that's not the case. I got sort of a behind the veil look at the life of a successful screenwriter, but it made me realize the way to do it is just to commit to the craft and the lifestyle. So I ended up quitting that job, moving from Los Angeles back to Canada, where I'm originally from. And I applied to this writing program in Toronto at a center founded by the late Norman Jewison called the Canadian Film Center.
mm,
And it's this 6 month, very intensive lab where you learn how to write pilots and you write spec scripts, that sort of thing. And through that program, met my first television agent who started putting me up for jobs. And so that's my television staffing career started in Toronto, where I
mm.
worked for about 10 years before making the move back to Los Angeles. And in that time, when I wasn't staffing on in a writer's room for a television show, if I had some periods of months off, I would be writing what they call practice novels, right? Novels that don't sell. So it is always sort of in a dream in the back of my mind. But in terms of earning a living, I was doing that through television writing.
Mm.
I have to imagine that had that sort of pace and consistency was helpful for when it came time to kind of being outside of the writer's room and sitting at the desk working on a solo novel.
Absolutely. There's the gift and the curse of TV writing is the speed of it.
Mhm.
Um, you wish you had more time. You never have enough time. Studios are always trying to save money, so they're always trying to make you produce more with less. But the result of that is you really train that muscle where you have a week to write a 60-minute screenplay, which is not a lot of time to write anything. And so you don't have time for doubt. And I fight, like I think a lot of writers, I fight with self doubt constantly. But when you're given a week, a deadline of a week, you have to physically push it aside just to meet the deadline. So it's often first thought, best thought, the first line of dialogue that comes to mind ends up on the page. And uh, what was interesting to me was the first time my very generous showrunner gave me a full script to write. and I went home and stared in terror at my laptop because I didn't have time to agonize. A lot of those first ideas ended up on the screen, and then that begets more confidence. And so the next
Mm.
time you're like, I've done it before, I can do it again. And so yeah, just working that muscle through repetition builds up that bit of confidence that you can do it. So when it came to the prose writing, to novel writing, yeah, I had banked that diligence and that discipline to
Mhm.
just get your butt in the chair and get those pages, get that quota, if you will, done. That definitely helped.
Okay.
Mm. Well,
Um,
go ahead.
no, just sort of a quick follow up question because I want to kind of more or less start the conversation here with the end. Pardon me, with the ends of things. It's a sort of a mystery thriller suspense, but it's very unique in that the central mystery actually sort of hinges on the character's journey of self discovery, and that becomes very, very linked to kind of how the thing unravels. Could you, without, I don't want to say too much, and I'm speaking obliquely because I don't want to spoil anything, but could you kind of set that up a little for listeners of how that kind of
Sure.
comes together?
So the premise of the novel is about a woman, a solo female traveler who disappears from a luxury beach resort in the Bahamas. And then our heroine, Laura, becomes embroiled in her disappearance and the police investigation that ensues. But to your point, the real story is around Laura and the process of self discovery that happens while she looks and searches for this missing solo female traveler, Diana. And for me, I've always been interested in protagonists who aren't so much unreliable, but aren't aware that they're unreliable,
Mm,
that are their own worst enemy.
yeah.
And Laura, you discover in the novel, is a bit of a catastrophizer. She sees the worst case scenario at all times. This is something that I struggle with myself. So I was also interested in that, in how you can be your own worst enemy, how you can get in your own way. And she lives with a lot of fear. And when she meets this very confident, unapologetic woman who goes to a romantic couples resort by herself,
Right.
it triggers something deep inside of her that she needs to explore and unpack.
Yeah.
Mm. That's a great description. I can tell you have written for TV. That was very succinct and grabbing. And well, you talked about this a little bit or alluded to it. What I was really struck by was the kind of closeness, the interior nature of your main character. Like I really felt like by the end I was in her brain, and I very much identified with her kind of hypervigilance and her catastrophizing. And I think it lends itself really well to kind of the tension that you create. And I was just wondering, given that you are writing for the page as opposed to the screen, did you feel more kind of liberation to like really delve into the character's backstory and thoughts in a way that you can't do obviously with the other medium?
100%. That was one of the great joys of this whole process. Screenwriting is so, in some ways, very similar in terms of the kind of emotional homework you have to do
Mm-hmm.
when you're storytelling. But on a craft level, screenplays are all about the art of concision. They're a lot more similar to poetry in that way. You're trying to convey a lot of information and emotion with as few words as possible. And they're also very sort of physical documents. They're about movement through space.
Mm,
They're about how people relate to other characters in locations. And there's not a lot of room for interiority, like you mentioned, for insight. And those are my two favorite things that I love to read about and write about. So I've often felt constrained as a screenwriter because there's no way, save voiceover, to have that outlet. And what you gain in return is incredible performances by actors who bring that interiority through their performance. But I personally, as a writer, really missed that ability to express myself in that way. So when I was writing prose, you could be inside the mind of your character for an entire chapter,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was really freeing and really fun, to be able to stretch that muscle, which you don't get to very often in television.
I
yeah.
bet.
If you're looking at sort of what you were just talking about, let's say the limitations of certain forms, right? So the limitation, as you mentioned, with screenwriting is you have to really get a lot of exposition in dialogue, but you have to you have to work it so that the audience isn't um, aware that they're being fed a lot of exposition, right? So these are things that you have to build as skill sets. And then I'm wondering, when you go back to prose writing and you don't have those sort of roadblocks necessarily, are there things that you felt like you're just able to like really go into, or things that like maybe having those parameters, having worked within the framework of those parameters, does that help you then be able to do, other things like with prose writing and so forth and exposition?
Yeah, it was a really fascinating discovery. My writing was described to me as cinematic, and I
Mhm.
didn't know what that meant. I thought people were saying, "Oh, she writes for TV, so it's cinematic."
Right.
But what I discovered was, when I was writing chapters of the novel, I personally was very preoccupied with the blocking of the characters in a scene,
Okay.
much more so than lots of novelists that I read.
Yeah.
If I'm reading a book, I know I'm following the path of the character, but I don't necessarily know where they are in a room, or where someone is in relation to them in the kitchen of the scene in the novel.
Yeah.
Versus for myself, because that's such a big part of the job of television writing, because you're physically moving actors on a set, and everyone has to have logic in their movements, and they have to have motivation. And if you don't block your scene properly, your actors will embarrass you and publicly on set, and humiliate you. So you really have to do your homework. I found that I instinctively brought that self-imposed pressure into the novel writing. And I needed to make sure it made sense where everyone was. What are they doing with their hands?
Mhm.
What are they physically doing while the scene is unfolding? That I wasn't intentionally setting up to do that, but that muscle that I've trained from television writing followed me, and I think that's why my writing is described to me as cinematic, because it's very preoccupied with people moving through physical space and people relating to each other, maybe a bit more than the average novel,
Right.
I think.
Yeah, and I could see, I can see that in your kind of storytelling style, and I think that really works because I wanted to ask you about the setting is really distinct and really vivid, and I think you spend a lot of time talking about the environment and the setting. So, do you want to maybe talk about the inspiration to set it where you did, and then kind of the practically speaking, how that informed the plot or vice versa?
Sure.
Mhm.
So the idea for the novel came to me while I was on vacation
Mhm.
at a resort in the Bahamas on the island of Eleuthera.
Mhm.
So I had wanted for many years to travel to one of these beautiful boutique resorts. I was a workaholic, I was perpetually single. So when I finally had a break and I was in a new relationship, we went to this gorgeous resort. And I was so taken by the beauty of this island. I'd never heard of Eleuthera. I'd never heard of this place. It was so remote. And while I was there, just like the beginning of the novel, amongst the beautiful couples sunbathing, I noticed this one woman vacationing by herself.
Mhm.
And I was really struck by my feelings, because at first I found myself to be sort of intrigued by her. And then I found myself being jealous.
Mhm.
Like, what does she have that I don't have? How come I could never do this? How come I've denied myself this pleasure for so long? I found myself getting angry, like at her, at myself. I didn't know. And when I left the vacation and went home, I was still thinking about her and these emotions. And that's, I think, what compelled me to first write a short story, and then plan out this longer manuscript, because I knew I needed to unpack some emotional turmoil of my own. So that's what inspired the novel. But the setting itself, um, I'd never been to the Bahamas before. It's an incredible place. I'd never seen pink sand before. It was just such surreal beauty. But specifically, I've always been fascinated by a concept of a vacation, and by the idea of resorts, because they're such like oxymorons. Like, there's so much hypocrisy and conflict within a vacation, right? It's like this compressed period of time. You go with someone, there's pressure for intimacy, there's pressure for togetherness. You need the weather to cooperate. If it doesn't cooperate, it ruins the vacation. Every day has so much value because you're paying so much money and it's such a short period of time that you're supposed to go there to relax. And yet there's this unspoken pressure. I find that friction really interesting as a
Mhm.
writer. And then resorts. They're these oases. They're supposed to have the feeling of unspoiled natural beauty, these like little hidden gems in nature. But of course, they're completely fabricated, right? The sand is flown in from somewhere else. The beautiful, perfect beaches are, you know, built from dynamite. Like nothing is real. All the After a day, you realize that everyone who's waiting on you lives in the nearby village at a much lower standard of living, and you start to feel really gross. And so
Mhm.
this like all the hypocrisy I find also really interesting. So a vacation on this beautiful place at this resort just seems so rich and ripe for sort of narrative tension.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, you used the term friction a couple moments ago, which I think perfectly encapsulates so many layers of this novel. As you said, there's the idea of the manicured resort versus the sort of the wildness of the surrounding land. You also have something you mentioned a few moments ago as well, is this what kind of enraptured you in your own vacation of this single woman at this couples retreat. And in the story, your character Laura, her mother has sort of hammered in this idea of to her that like the world is built for couples, not singles. And I
Mhm.
wonder when you're talking about that tension that you were kind of feeling and then sort of parsing as you got home, how much of that was that idea were you going in with, or was that something that sort of developed as you got into the story further?
I mean, that idea that the world is built for couples has been something that I've grown up with.
Yeah.
It's sort of been drilled into me from my family, from friends, from society, much like the protagonist, much like Laura.
Mm.
And so I was really interested in confronting some of these fears that have been instilled in me and challenging them as well. Are they warranted? And can you be a woman alone in the world and be safe? Or are you always perpetually a target? Are you always made to be a victim? Because I feel like as a woman in the world, you're in a constant state of whiplash. You're told, go out there, live your dreams, be brave, be bold, don't have fear. And you're also being told you should be terrified. Women are always victims. You can't be a woman and you can't be a childless cat lady. Like there's this constant clash in narrative that is really confusing. And I find it confusing now. And so part of the novel was to confront those fears and just to see if any of them have merit.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah, I think you did that really well. And as someone who used to kind of be on the other side of this, I went on quite a few vacations alone. Um, partially because I wanted to feel like I had that agency and that freedom. And then because I maybe was unattached and I didn't want to be missing out. But the thing that I really resonated with in your novel was this idea of, the woman in peril, even, with having agency and decision making, as Diana, this character, very interesting, elusive character, had. And one of the things that I remember from doing a couple of these like inclusive resort trips by myself was this like false sense of safety. Because, like, as you mentioned, it's very like insulated and everything's very, it's all very practiced and deliberate. But stepping outside of that safety was really, it was unsafe, you know. And I think maybe this lends itself to your novel is not exactly like a thriller in the traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Although you do kind of talk about this woman in peril theme. Do you want to talk about, without spoiling anything, how that might differ from other thrillers or what people might be expecting from like the cover or the setup?
Sure. Yes, this is categorized technically as a psychological suspense.
Hmm.
But I always thought of it as like a literary thriller, which is one of my favorite genres. And so, setting out to write this book, I wanted to write a book that I would want to read on vacation.
Hmm.
To me, picking a book for a vacation is harder than picking the destination or the outfits. For me, it's all about the read, and I have like very specific wants. I want something that makes me want to turn the page, but I also want something with like, beautiful sentences or insight.
Hmm.
And a lot of thrillers are very twist driven, um, and don't have a lot of room for imagery or insight. But a lot of literary fiction has beautiful writing, but isn't necessarily propulsive. And
Hmm.
so I'm always looking for that hybrid that has both. And so that was one of the motivators for this. Was I wanted to write the style of book that I like, but to that end, it because it's this sort of genre hybrid. It doesn't fall neatly into the category of a traditional thriller. Like when you walk into a bookstore and there's that wall of thrillers. It's not that typical. It doesn't follow that typical formula in a sense. So it has this very unconventional ending, and it also, as to your point earlier, it's like it's delving into these deeper themes around female friendship, female agency, and so the ending might surprise some people. It might delight other people, but it's not your typical, like I would say, like dead body thriller.
Right.
To put it plainly.
Well, before we started recording, we talked a little bit and we wanted to save it for the episode about Goodreads and reader response, because I know with some of our books, um, some of the less, I would say, enthusiastic or positive reviews have taken issue with this wasn't maybe the book they thought it was, or they didn't feel like it was marketed directly. And I think this is an interesting conundrum that authors and genre come up against all the time. We've definitely talked about it on the show. And, I guess there's things that are out of our control as authors for sure. And there's a lot of people that go into getting our books on the shelves. That aside, I'm just wondering from your perspective, like where you fall on the readers' responses, reading reviews, platforms like Goodreads. How does that factor into your process, your self-doubt, your feelings about your writing, et cetera?
Yeah, it's such a double-edged sword. Like I'm thrilled that Goodreads exists. I'm thrilled that there's this community of readers who are
Mhm.
so passionate that they take the time to write these incredibly astute, detailed, thoughtful reviews,
Yeah.
just out of their own initiative. But yeah, the first time I read a bad review of my novel was crushing. And my agent said, sort of after the fact, she's like, you shouldn't go on Goodreads. Just don't do that. But I'd already gone on. I hadn't been warned. And as a television writer, you're kind of hiding in a tribe in a way, right? You're in a writer's room of 10 or 12 people and you're serving a showrunner. So the buck sort of stops with the showrunner, right? You're
Mhm.
hired to service the production. And so if the show gets bad reviews, it's unfortunate, but you don't feel it in a visceral,
Yeah.
personal way. But when it's your book and it's your name, it's a whole other experience. But then, and my agent said, don't go on, don't engage, don't go back, just let it be. But of course, I'm very used to rejection as a screenwriter. It's you get rejected way more often than you don't.
Mhm.
So I was already sort of inured to that,
Mhm.
and I was just curious. But then there'd be these really positive reviews that were very long and thoughtful and would quote parts of the novel. And I was like, okay, so there's people out there who are getting this and loving this.
Mhm.
It's just not for everyone. And the commonality I noticed was the less you know going into this book, the fewer expectations you have, the better. Because you're going in more open minded. You're not expecting a certain type of formula. So that would be if I could shout it from the rooftops, it'd be like kind of go in blind.
Yeah.
Don't go in with expectations, and I think you might be pleasantly surprised.
Well, you
Mm.
mentioned earlier
Mm.
the idea of how much you love a beautiful sentence in a genre-driven thing, and if you don't mind, I'm going to actually kick one of yours back to you right now. So this
Okay.
is again about your main character Laura. and it's sort of describing her mindset around relationships. And I just love this line so much. Even in the first blush of infatuation, she packed emotional go bags and wrote scripts in her head, preparing herself for the inevitable end. It's such a beautiful sentence, and it's also such a great way to get into the sort of psychology of a character, and then also to set up one of the main tenets of your kind of tension in the plot. And I just wondered, as you were kind of discovering Laura, that character, as she was starting to speak to you a bit, if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of that process of discovery of that character.
Sure. Well, that's also an interesting passage that you chose because that's right around where the phrase that inspired the title, or the title was taken from a phrase in and around that passage. This idea of the ends of things, right?
Right.
Laura's a catastrophizer, but she wasn't always this way. So that's the other thing the
Yeah.
novel explores is to what degree do our relationships from our past and our experiences, positive and negative, our formative experiences, inform who
Mhm.
we become as adults,
Mm.
and what is it that we carry with us into adulthood, like what kind of baggage, what kind of unhealed wounds do we carry with us into adulthood that then play out similar patterns and cycles that we keep seeing in our adult life.
Mm.
And so that was very much what I was exploring with Laura. Was you'll in the novel you'll learn that she had this very important seminal female friendship in girlhood that really defined her sort of self, the way she identifies, or her sort of mythology that she has about herself. She had some bad experiences in romantic relationships, which then inform how she behaves in relationships as a young adult. And so that was something I was really interested in: is what are those things from our past? And so in she kind of hinders herself in her present day relationships because she can't enter into them um, with a clean slate. She's carrying scars and wounds from the past, which is an unfair thing to do in relationships, but we can't, we're human, we can't help it. So it's very much about the past. You're constantly in dialogue with
Mm.
your past
Mm.
and with those formative years, for sure.
Yeah, I thought some of your most kind of vivid and evocative writing was when she was flashing back to that formative friendship. And I thought you really explored the kind of intensity that those like female friendships when we're girls are. And I'm saying us and our because that's my personal experience. The intensity and the kind of feelings of it's like so amplified because of the age and everything happening. And I wondered, you talked about doing the kind of character, the emotional homework, which I love. And that's something that Greg and I do a lot in our writing. And we also did when we were actors. And how much how deep did you go into those kind of like emotional homework realms with all of the characters? And then how did you decide what you were actually going to keep in the story itself? Because I thought your economy in
Yeah.
that was really good, but it's so hard, I find, I want to put it all in.
Well, can I answer the second part first? Because
Yeah.
that was one of the hardest parts, and I have to give credit to my developmental editor, Celia Johnson. She gave me such an incredible piece of advice that unlocked something in my brain. In an earlier draft of the novel, those flashbacks were longer, and they played out in real time, and they had dialogue, and they were really more fully fleshed out scenes. And in the editing process, she said to me, what is it that Laura carries with her?
Mm.
You know, so drop everything that was just sort of color in the scene. And what is the thing? Distill it down to the thing that Laura still carries with her today, and then make it about that. And that, I don't know, that just like blew my mind, because I was like, yes, because that's how we are as adults. We
Mm.
don't move through our day with these massive scenes from high school playing out in our mind.
Mhm.
It's just these little moments, it's these little comments that someone made once in 10th grade, or some observation someone made about you, or said something that stays in your head if it was said by the person that had influence on you. It's one little kernel that means so much and defines so much, but it's this little tiny thing. And that opened this door in my brain. I was like, and then it became really easy to cut and edit. It was just like, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's this.
Hmm.
And what are those handful of details that really shaped who this character still is today based on an incident that happened in the past? So that was incredible advice given by an incredible editor, for sure.
I have sort of a corollary question with that one. One of the things that if you don't mind, I'm going to read another small section as well. I think this is, again, a beautiful way to put this, and I think it becomes, on many levels, it becomes sort of a through line theme of this story. It's, again, from Laura's perspective, how easy it was to misunderstand someone and to be misunderstood, and how easily those misunderstandings could evolve into mythologies that felt real and true. And that struck me because I feel like for all of us, we have those things in our lives, right? That because of a lack of communication or because of like confirmation bias that we're working with at any given time, you have these things that become these, accumulations of, sometimes it's resentment, sometimes it's sadness, sorrow, loss. And I just thought that was such a, again, to your point, it's like you use this sort of vehicle of this mystery thriller to really delve into the sort of human psychology components of that. And I was just wondering if you could talk just a little bit about that idea of this like self mythology that we kind of carry.
Sure. No, and I love that you pointed out, because that's so what this is about. It's about, and I relate to Laura in this way, where we move through the world with these stories we tell about ourselves and who we are in relation to other people. Are we cool? Are we lame? Are we smart? Are we not? Are we successful? Are we failures? We have these definitions about ourselves based on past experiences, based on feedback that we've gotten, whether it should be feedback we listen to or not. And Laura is very much this way. But often we hear what we want to hear. To your point about confirmation bias, we're cherry picking comments based on our view of ourselves, which can be completely inaccurate. And often it's what we are only interested in one side of the conversation. But if we had an altercation with a friend years ago that bred resentment that led to a falling out, we only remember conveniently the side of the argument that we remember. We don't remember the other side, right? It's inconvenient to our mythology to remember, another point of view. And so the novel's very much concerned with that, with appearance versus reality, and how we often miscommunicate with each other, misremember things, see what we want to see, and ignore what doesn't fit into our convenient narrative that we have about ourselves and with others. So that plays into Laura's journey, but also the story of this missing woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, and speaking of mythology, and I won't spoil here, but you have a really kind of beautiful allusion to some mythology throughout that has, carries from the past story into the present. And I know as a writer myself and a lover of books and stories, I have kind of always returned to Greek mythology and other mythology when I feel like whether stuck or I'm looking for inspiration or I want to kind of layer. Did you consciously, when you were going into writing this book, did you think I want to kind of call on that? Or was it the other way around? Was it like, oh, this kind of works as as mythology?
That was one of those, how when you're writing, as you know, you have this plan and then something comes in the side door and surprises you in the most beautiful like way of a happy accident. And it just makes all the struggle worth it because you have this beautiful moment of sort of clarity. That was the case here. I didn't set out to make allusions to Greek mythology or I didn't, in my mind, Diana, that the woman who disappears, is sort of like a modern embodiment of a Greek goddess, in that she's this cipher, she's sort of unknowable, yet she can interfere with the life of a mortal. And this is a character who is very much that. She, in certain crucial ways, interferes with Laura's life. but she's this mystery. And it came later. It came when I was sort of researching the island of Eleuthera, which is in the Bahamas. And the name of the island comes from the Greek, and the word itself means freedom, which I found really interesting and beautiful. And so much of the novel is about agency and confidence and feeling free to do what you want. But it was also the epithet for the Greek goddess um, um, Diana, and who Our Missing Woman is named after. So that was an Artemis. So that struck me as significant. Like there's something here, in the novel, Laura, when she's a girl, dreams of being confident and free and well traveled and unmarried and just this sort of badass woman with her best friend, which is very much who Artemis was, right? She was unmarried. She was this huntress. She sort of spurned men. And so I was through the research, it kept kind of popping up, and it just kind of in one moment kind of came together, and I was like, oh, there's something here. This wants to be connected. This wants to be this motif that travels through. And I had named her Diana without realizing why. It was just and then one day kind of came together in this very beautiful like epiphany. And I was like, oh, okay, this is what it wants to be. So let's let it be that.
Yeah.
There's kind of speaking to the idea of self-confidence and agency and things like that. There's this great sort of moment that Laura has at one point in the book, where she's sort of ruminating on this very grown-up idea of the sort of outward signaling of success, kind of where you are in your life in terms of your relationship status, in terms of your career status, your salary, stuff like that. And she really goes through a sort of reappraisal of that. And again, without saying too much else to kind of, do any spoilers or anything like that, that just felt like such a beautiful kind of evolution of that character with everything you would set her up with, from the jump.
Thank you for saying that. I don't know about you, but I found that in my late 20s and early 30s, physical manifestation of success was really important to me. It was, as my friends and peers started to have higher paid jobs and they could afford to buy property and afford nicer furniture, it became this signaling, this need to show status became really important all of a sudden. And so I wanted to. This book is very much concerned with sort of a young professional woman, and insecurity. And one way is to mask that insecurity is by sort of building this sort of shell around you that signals that you're very confident, you're very secure, you're very successful. And of course, a lot of that is very much just a facade. And there's nothing like going out in the middle of nowhere in nature and sort of stripping away all of that protective armor to help you realize you don't actually need any of it. And it didn't, I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence that I was going through a lot of this while writing the novel during the pandemic. That's when I wrote, 2020 and 2021 is when I wrote the manuscript. And that was a really, obviously, emotionally difficult time for a lot of people. And that was a time when, for me professionally, Hollywood went quiet. The gift of that was it allowed me to have time to do the writing, but it was also just a very existential time. A lot of people were recalibrating what was important to them, what really matters. Write your dream project, write the thing that you don't care if you'll ever sell. Like, it was this very sort of interestingly spiritual time as well. So I'm sure that bled into it, where I, as a person, was going through, like a lot of people were going through an emotionally kind of, uncertain time. And so Laura as well, in leaving her very defined world of her condo in Manhattan and her upwardly mobile career to this wild, barren island where she gets gradually more and more vulnerable and exposed. Those are sort of happening in parallel.
Well, you answered a question I had, which lends itself to a bigger question, I think, and just a point of relating to you, which is timing. I was wondering when you wrote this book in relation to becoming a mother, because you have a daughter who's under the age of 1, so you have a baby, and it sounds like you wrote the novel a few years before you had your daughter. Um, but you're talking about this kind of like reorganization or this shifting of priorities in yourself when you were writing and also in the character of Laura. And I found that when I left my full time in house publishing job to write full time, that was a real shifting point in my life of going from being kind of workaholic and status driven to wanting to just create for myself. And I thought that was the kind of ultimate shift. And then I became a mother and had an even bigger shift of
Yes.
priorities and time management and mental health and all the things. So I'm wondering for you, and even more so because you have a daughter and you've written so much about what it's like to be a young woman and a woman in her 20s or 30s. How has, your kind of perspective changed about, any aspect of your life um, compared to maybe when you were writing the novel versus now?
I mean, great question. I don't remember who I was. It's so strange. I don't remember who I was before this baby exploded my life. Like I I don't know who that person was. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm really glad that that person was able to write this book because I could not I I could not have written this book now. Um and so I'm really glad that it exists. Like it's this sort of time capsule of this person who I was. But and I was told your life's going to change, it's going to be different. But I would see moms at the park on their phones, and I'm like, okay, it can't be that hard. And it is. And I've done some hard things in my life. I've had challenging jobs. I've had to like work in a country where I don't know the language. And I've had, I've had my ups and downs, but my God, it is so hard. And I think women like underplay it.
Mhm.
There's this constant pressure to when you're a woman in the world to appear effortless.
Mhm.
You buy makeup because it doesn't look like you're wearing makeup, but it's a lot of makeup that you're wearing. And the baby is so I mean, I love her to death. I can't imagine my life without her. She's the most precious, you know, part of my life, but it's just so hard. I just had to say it because I don't think enough people say it.
Yeah. No, and I thank you for saying it. And, inevitably, when we have parents on the show, I think this does come up, or I lead the witness, because I think it's so important to talk about, the act of writing and creating, and how that changes when you have these big life events. So if you're child free or single or whatever your circumstances are, life happens and explodes any kind of maybe routine or sense of yourself or sense of others. And then that directly impacts, I think, our capacity to create. And I love what you said about the person you were before having your daughter and the novel you wrote then and
Yeah.
you couldn't write it now. I feel the same way. And I wonder, I'm sure there's lots of other examples. Greg, you probably have examples in your life that have changed you seismically, and the novels that you could have written before and after are different. Um, and I'm just, thinking about, you've done so much, you've accomplished so much. Where is imposter syndrome showing up in your life, or where has it historically, and has that changed since you've written this novel?
Yes, absolutely. And a great question. I just love how this is the premise of your podcast because I'm so glad you talk about it all the time. Because again, it's this thing where whether, you're a television writer and you read Deadline every day or you're reading Publishers Weekly and these announcements, you're constantly reading about success. Where's the deadline or the Publishers Weekly for all the books that didn't sell and all the pilots that never got ordered? Because there's way more of that to be written about than the ones that win the lottery. Because that's really what it is. It's luck and timing is 99% of it. Yeah, of course you have to work hard and you have to have a little bit of talent, but it's really luck and timing is so much of it. So I struggled with imposter syndrome. I mean, since college, leaving high school, I was a big fish in a small pond, and going to college, I was a tiny, plankton in a massive ocean. And then you're in your 20s, and there's all these, 30 under 30 lists, right? And I happen to have a lot of really high achieving classmates who are getting on these lists. So instantly you're feeling inadequate. As a screenwriter, you're like the story I told you before, you're thrown into this deep end, expected to deliver this screenplay that you've never written before. I never took an MFA. Everything I learned was from watching TV, reading books, watching movies, you know. Um, and so constant imposter syndrome. I mean, constantly. What I found interesting in having the novel published, which again, a lot of luck and timing, because I definitely collected a lot of passes. And with each pass that comes in, you're like, it's reaffirming the mythology that I had about myself, which is not good enough. I might like this book, but no one else is going to get it, which is something I often think is like, this is interesting to me, but I don't know if it's going to be interesting to anybody else. But my agent kept saying, you only need one. It only takes one. And so that was the mantra. And what I found that when the offer did come in from Blackstone, and when I went through the incredible process of editing with my developmental editor, my acquisitions editor, and just through the pipeline, when I came out the other side and was holding my book in my hand for the first time, what I found so interesting was that nothing was different. I was the same person. It's not like it's not like I was suddenly an author or a writer. What did change though was how everyone else treated me. Where all of a sudden friends came out of the woodwork and started sending me their manuscripts. They were treating me differently, even though I was the same. And there's this line in the book, which is so weird to reference a line in the book, but where Laura talks about being in a relationship and how nothing's changed, but suddenly you feel like the only way you know something has changed is like you're on a ship and nothing's moving, but the people on the shore are waving and getting smaller in the background, and you're something has changed, but nothing feels different. It felt like that. And I realized, that's because being a writer is not the same thing as being a published author. Being a writer is a state of mind. It's the way you inhabit the world. It's moving through the world and observing and taking away insight. I think that's what being a writer is. And I've always liked that, but I didn't respect it. But becoming published and realizing that I was the same person made me respect what it really means to be a writer, and that being published just validates that. But I was already a writer. I just didn't have the confidence to define myself that way. It wasn't part of the mythology. So that was a gift, was realizing that it was there all along. I just didn't give it enough give enough respect.
Something that you talk about really beautifully in the book, which I think relates to this in a way as well, in terms of presentation, in terms of that sort of idea of compare and despair that Liz and I sometimes will talk about on the show, but you do explore very deftly social media. And I wonder, you handle it beautifully in the book, and I wonder how much of that kind of comes from, your personal experience or observations around maybe how social media plays that part in terms of the probably both book and maybe TV and film industries.
Oh, sure. No, social media is the worst because it's all about curation and none of it's real, right? We all know this. This is not a new idea, but yeah. So Laura in the novel is very consumed with sort of face stalking her childhood friend and following the new changes in her life, husband, house, baby, dog, these sort of milestones, these markers of status or success, none of which Laura is experiencing herself. And I'm for sure guilty of face stalking over the years, various people. And I absolutely stayed away from Instagram for years because I knew that, if you're vulnerable enough, it can erode your self-worth. And then I
Mhm.
ended up joining it because I was told like this is a good place if you're launching a novel.
Mhm.
So much of the book is concerned with appearance versus reality and the ways that we create these false realities of who we are. To what end? Like, to in a comparative way, in a competitive way, in an aesthetic way that is completely artificial, and yet we're all sort of complicit in it and doing it.
Mhm.
So I find again there's that friction, that hypocrisy there that I also find really interesting. Um, as much as I play a part in it as well.
Mm. Sandra, I'm curious because you have now kind of you're straddling two creative industries. Do you find that, in terms of community, because we talk a lot about like community and writer support, are there market differences between, screenwriters and, prose writers that you found? I know there's a lot of crossover. Are there any kind of funny, quirky differences? I think about this when I was in books and I would do stuff with adaptations in Hollywood. There was always like 100 people on a conference call and yeah, we'll get that done and this, that, and the other. And then it was glacial, like nothing got done ever. um, but then that
Absolutely.
same could be said about book publishing. So have you noticed differences in those two worlds that are either amusing or frustrating?
Oh, so many. I mean, one is, when you're writing on a television show, you're in a room with a dozen other people and you're all being paid to solve problems.
Mm.
And not necessarily your problems. They could be problems in someone else's script. And so when you have a logic hole or a weak act out or a weak cliffhanger, you can bring it to this room of very smart, creative people and say, help me make this better. And then everyone helps you make it better. When you're writing a novel, you're basically by yourself. You're lucky if you have like you guys, you're lucky if you have a beta reader or a close friend or someone to bounce ideas off of. And I'm so much of a verbal person. I need to talk it out. So I definitely missed that. I love the camaraderie in a writer's room where you stay friends. I have group chats from years ago, but long after the show has been canceled, we're still in a massive group chat and we still hang out and see each other and that sort of thing. So you don't have that as much when you're a novel writer. Um, and but on the flip side, if you commit to a story choice in your novel, you have to wear that. You cannot put that on someone else. If there's criticism, it's your name on it. So that was definitely a rude awakening. But in terms of the industry itself, I Hollywood is incredibly slow unless you're in network television, and then it's very fast.
Mhm.
Um, but I found the book world even slower, but much much kinder. I
Mhm.
mean, people in Hollywood do not mince words, and there's a harshness, in that world that in the world of books, there's just this warmth that was a really nice surprise. I think people know they're handling your baby in a way, and so there's a gentleness even when you're getting notes. I'm so
Mhm.
used to not having anything sugar coated. And so, when my editor was sending me her notes, she was being very gentle. And I was like, I can take it. Just give it to me. I can handle it. So I think they were a little surprised with that,
Yeah.
I'd
for
love to
sure.
kind of part two that with now a little more of the craft side of the difference. Having now, having written for TV and film for years and now having written a novel, what parts of that process do you the novel writing process, do you now bring back to a TV or film kind of environment?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say definitely the character work, or we talked about
Mm.
emotional homework. Um, since having the novel published, I've gone back to do some development work in television, and the consistent feedback has been, wow, the character work is great here. It's really deep. Oh, these motives are so emotional. These types of things where I had thought previously I was a character writer, but running through the gauntlet of editing the
Mhm.
novel with my editor, she kept pushing me deeper and deeper into these pockets of different parts of the novel. that was training a muscle that I'd never really been challenged to train before. And I walked away with what felt like an MFA in not just suspense storytelling, but also character storytelling that I now take back to television, wherever I can. And like you, Liz, I also do quite a bit of adaptation work. So that's been interesting as well, where people always say, "Oh, the show is not as good as the book, or this or that," and it's been an education being on both sides of it to see why certain books lend really well to adaptation and why others don't.
Mhm.
And just because a novel is beautifully written or deeply felt doesn't mean it's going to translate well to the kind of visual, dynamic, kinetic medium that TV is and demands to be. So it's been interesting being on both sides and seeing what works and
Mhm.
what doesn't and why.
Hmm. Along those lines, did you, when you were working on the ends of things, were you kind of conscious of like this would adapt well, or was that not something you were kind of factoring into the process?
It's interesting. The first incarnation of the story that I had in my mind was of a feature film. I
Mm.
actually started outlining a screenplay. But when I read the outline back to myself after, I realized that all my favorite parts were the stage directions. It kept getting longer and longer and more detailed and more observational. Everything that would be cut from the outline when you went on to draft, and I realized, oh, I'm going to lose all this stuff, and I really like this stuff. These little musings she has. But as a screenwriter, I know like this is such amateur hour. This will never work in a screenplay format, and yet I want to hold on to it.
Right.
That was the first signal, like maybe this wants to be something else.
Mm.
Um, and so that was and now, if you go back the other way, a lot of that would have to change or be dropped. So it's an
Mhm.
interesting challenge.
Yeah.
Are you do you tend to have that experience? Let's say when you have an idea, do you tend to kind of, have a general shape of like what that would be suited best for, or does that oftentimes come, after you've maybe tried a draft of something in one format?
It, I face it constantly. It's such an interesting question, but finding the right vehicle for your story is half the battle. And some ideas, because I've now done both. I've written pilots, features, novels. I sometimes it takes a while to play with an idea to say what is the
Yeah.
best form for this story. Is this a novel? Does it have enough
Mm.
emotional heft to warrant being a novel? Is it exploring deep enough material, or are we losing some? That's definitely something with ideas I have now. Or I have, a pilot that never sold, and I was like, but these characters live in my head rent free, and I
Mhm.
miss them, and I want to like get to know them better, and I wished I could have done that in series. Hey, maybe this is actually a novel in multiple perspectives, so that's definitely something I think about all the time.
Mm. Well, sadly, with our last minute or two, we would love to hear what's next for you. Are you going to work on another novel? Have you already? What's in store? What can we look forward to?
I have a proposal for a domestic thriller,
Ooh.
set in an affluent neighborhood in Los Angeles. So we'll see where that goes. And then, yes, on the TV front, I'm developing a couple different pilots, and we'll see where that goes as well. And hoping the industry will start to pick up
Right.
sooner rather than later.
Irons in the
Yes.
fire. Beautiful.
Oh,
Well, Sandra, thank you
Exactly.
for sharing your time with us today. This has been a pleasure to talk. Could you, as we're wrapping up, just let people know where they can find you on social media or out in the world?
Sure. I have a website, so it's Sandra-C.com, and I'm also on Instagram at
All right.
SandraCHW.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, Sandra. Everyone, check out her amazing debut novel, and we look forward to whatever you have coming next. And
Well,
Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Harrogate, and Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Loama designed our
And you can
logo.
find us on IG at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Thanks for listening.